Oh, got it. So in the study up on the screen here, all participants were testing a true painkiller and placebo painkiller, or what we thought was a true painkiller, but they're unaware of which one they were in. And so each of the 44 people in this study wore each of 4 magnetic bracelets over a 4-month period. And I say magnetic in inverted commas because the true experimental bracelet was a commercially available magnetic wrist strap, and there were 3 other devices: a weak magnetic wrist strap, a demagnetized wrist strap, and a non-magnetic copper bracelet. And they were very scientific in this study. They measured outcome using 3 different validated pain questionnaires and whether or not medications were required. And there were no improvements in any of these measures. However, the magnetic wrist strap did show a statistically significant benefit for one specific measure of pain sensation. Now, the conclusion that was made by the study authors was that although participants reported lower sensory pain after wearing the standard magnetic wrist strap than when wearing a control device, apologies, my computer's not playing nicely at the moment. I would encourage any magnet enthusiast that are keen to grasp this sliver of hope with this concept. If it were you that were one of the painful individuals enrolled in this 4-month trial, didn't know which group you were in, could you put your hand on your heart and swear that you wouldn't accidentally pop your hand in the cutlery drawer? I certainly would. And the authors concluded that there was not enough information to support the use of magnetic or copper bracelets. They're generally ineffective for managing pain. And in their opinion, any beneficial effects were most likely attributable to the placebo effect. Even so, any one of us could go online and find no shortage of animal magnets, and companies including BioFlow, Walking Mate, and MagnoMut are out there vying for their share of the canine arthritis market. One of the manufacturers that grabbed my eye is a company called Dogstreams, based in the UK, who use 360-degree resonance technology. And according to their website, this was developed thanks to a scientific understanding of how each and every cell within a dog naturally interacts with magnetic fields. So how do our dogs naturally interact with magnetic fields? Because we're talking about a magnet here that's positioned far from the painful joint, and a field which, even if it were positioned directly over a joint, would need a magnet the size of an MRI scanner to exert a measurable effect within the joint itself. So how can a magnet exert effects on a joint that's located outside its range? Well, the manufacturers have an elegant theory, and they instruct caregivers to position the magnet over a large blood vessel. In the dog's case, this is the jugular vein. Red blood cells coursing through the vein contain hemoglobin, which in turn contains iron. The fact that blood contains iron is the reason why some people believe that magnets might have an effect on humans and animals. In theory, the magnet attracts the iron, causing the blood cells to form an orderly queue. When the orderly red blood cells reach an inflamed joint, they work their magic. Sadly, there's a giant fly in the ointment, because the iron in hemoglobin isn't ferromagnetic. In other words, its weak paramagnetic properties are not sufficiently powerful to make blood susceptible to external magnetic fields. Even so, the average animal caregiver isn't going to be exposed to this information. They're going to go on the website and read this. This is highly recommended technology. I'm certain that the Streams collar has made a significant impact on my dogs, both pre and post competition. I love their approach so much that Streams became sponsors of Team GB in 2017. And this isn't a quote from just anybody. This is the captain of the 2017 Great Britain Agility Team. So we can compare their statement to a statement that was made by Dr. Stuart Richmond, who's the author of the aforementioned study on magnetic bracelets in people. And Dr. Richmond said, if blood was ferromagnetic, then people would bleed to death or explode in MRI scanners, which produce much stronger magnetic forces than those of magnetic bracelets. So it should be clear at this point that we're entering into a science versus faith argument, and they rarely end well. Just as an atheist won't convince somebody their deity doesn't exist, a joint supplement enthusiast won't concede that the supporting evidence is in fact not especially supportive. So it probably doesn't matter what I say, individuals with faith in their preferred treatment are unlikely to listen to somebody who questions that faith. Even so, animals are vulnerable when we make mistakes, and I've sworn to protect them, which is why I'm here talking about this subject. On the subject of faith, I found this it's a slight aside, but quite interesting. And several studies have actually assessed the impact of prayers said by strangers on recovery from heart surgery. For example, and I'm quoting here, I pray this surgery is successful and no additional procedures will be needed. Wrap name of the patient in your loving embrace and protect them from harm. Bless the doctors who will be performing the surgery and thank you, God, for your steadfast love and protection. End quotation. So did this help? Well, the answer is it depends who you ask. And when patients and doctors were unaware they were part of a study, in this paper on the left of your screen, prayer seemed to improve recovery, but in another study, which is on the right of your screen, patients who knew a stranger was praying for them actually suffered a significantly higher complication rate. So what you take from prayer depends on the paper that you read. And on the subject of the paper that you read, I'll ask an important question of how lay people source their facts. And I suspect everybody who's listening to this is going to say, using Dr. Google, so it'll be no surprise that the next slide involves Dr. Google. Now, a 2021 survey found the average American spends a massive 156 hours every year scouring the internet to better understand their own health. Now, I have circled some information here. First circle is I'm feeling lucky, and the second circle is report inappropriate predictions. And I'm feeling lucky applies to lay people, and report inappropriate predictions applies to veterinary practitioners. So several times every year, I ask Google the following question: can ACL injuries in dogs heal? I ask it because I already know the answer. Now, regardless of my location, of the millions of available results of this particular example, 32,700,000, the top hit is always the same. Here's the answer. It's entirely possible for a dog to recover from an ACL tear without surgery. And this surprising result should prompt two questions. Question one, can I trust the source? And question two, is what they claim true? Now, it does take a little time to learn that the source, a company called OrthoDog, is actually an orthotics manufacturer. So we do have a conflict of interest, which should trigger a red flag. And to answer question two, we need some robust science. Unfortunately, we have some pretty good science. So in answer to the question, do most dogs treated using knee braces return to normal? I've included here a paper on the right-hand side and a decision aid on the left-hand side, which says decision aid is essentially a way that I extract information from papers, and using vet lessons, I put it into a format which is kind of easy to understand, and it's not intended to persuade, it's just intended to present the facts in a way that people can understand. So here we have the facts from this study. So do most dogs treated using knee braces return to normal? And the short answer is no. In the 2017 survey here, 173 dogs were managed using custom braces, and the results were not encouraging. Average lameness score for dogs with a unilateral condition was 3 out of 5, with 5 being the severest grade. 97 out of 100 dogs received long-term painkillers, with many of them actually taking a cocktail of multiple painkillers. And on top of that, this is not a cheap option. Typical cost of a single daily prescription painkiller for a 30-kilo dog is about $600 to $800 every year. So this study actually teaches us to be careful with online claims. A high Google ranking means something's popular, but it does public need to know that being popular doesn't mean source of information is trustworthy. I've included there a comparison of TPLO surgery, which is overwhelmingly the choice of specialists who are asked the question, how would you treat your own pet? And it should be quite clear the reason why that's their choice. So the picture here on the left-hand side really does paint 1,000 words. Here's evidently a dog that's had a thought that they would go outside and then rapidly change their mind. Loss aversion is an expression which refers to the fear of a negative outcome being more persuasive than the hope of a positive outcome. And this is actually where most people begin their journey with a sick or injured pet. Now my role and my title is orthopedic surgeon, and I am pretty confident that when an owner sees me, they see in front of them the enemy. In their eyes, I'm someone who'd prefer to operate than to avoid surgery. But in reality, I'm actually no different to them. I reserve surgery for animals who absolutely need surgery. And this is why I only operate about 1 in 5 dogs I see with hip dysplasia and around 1 in 2 dogs I see with elbow dysplasia. Now, when someone searches for online healthcare information, what they learn depends on not only the available information, but actually how they process it. And there are 2 ways to process information. The first is called systematic processing, and that's effortful processing, where conclusions are based on intensive reasoning. The reason for the Tinder images here is that if a systematic processor were to use a dating app, they'd ignore the photos and find their soulmate using dispassionate logic. And for a vivid example, think of Mr. Spock. But in the real world, there are not many true systematic processors. Most people process information heuristically. And that means a tendency to embrace data which suits our personal preferences and ignore or dismiss conflicting information. So a heuristic processor on a dating app would consider the facts, but they place a high value on first impressions. When they search for healthcare advice, there's a good chance that a heuristic processor would find a match in inverted commas. And that's in part because healthcare publications are essentially sales pitches for the author's beliefs. And in dating app terms, scientists would have flawless photos, interesting jobs, fascinating hobbies, and dazzling personalities. And it's a scientist's job to sell their ideas. And it's the rest of our jobs to determine if their claims are too good to be true. So in the study that I've got up in the middle here, this is not something I'd recommend trying to read because it's an extremely boring and dry read, but the take-home message is interesting. A team of Silicon Valley computer analysts, they created algorithms to determine whether web users showed predictable browsing behavior. So there's a hypothesis called information foraging theory, where foraging refers to the habit of navigating from page to page along a series of web links. So the content of pages associated with each link is presented as snippets, and we know those as clickbait. And what they wanted to do was to work out, could they predict where somebody would go along this path purely by the question they were asking? So this information foraging theory proposes that a user's behavior is guided by something called information scent. And the study actually did validate information foraging theory. In other words, browsing behavior is rational and it's extremely predictable. So to go back to our TPLO question, can a dog's ACL injury heal without surgery? And the #1 hit being yes. Well, there's a good reason why that hit is there. It's because if your goal is to avoid surgery in your dog, which is everyone's goal, you and like-minded individuals will drive up the popularity of sites which suit your goal. So there's a good reason why sites which essentially peddling misinformation often end up the top hit when you make an internet search. I think many lay people see scientific publications as something which represents the work of a scientist who's Spock, governed by logic, but that's just not at all true. And this study here, which was published in the British Medical Journal in 2015, just illustrates how untrue it is. So this group measured the frequency of positive sounding words in scientific abstracts. And they found that use of the words like promising, unique, and groundbreaking increased 9-fold over 4 decades. Whilst over the same period, use of negative sounding words increased from 1% to 3%. And the authors wryly predicted that if the trend continued, the word novel would appear in every single scientific abstract by 2123, 100 years from now. And the take-home message is that when you're presented with scientific evidence, you have a choice. You can either accept it at face value, which is what most people do, or you can channel your inner Spock and suspend your judgment until you've properly evaluated the science. It's a much harder exercise. So back to the magnetic collars. It would have been very straightforward for streams to prove their product's effect. And I've got here actually a white paper that they have on their website. And what they should have done would be manufacture 2 collars. One would have genuine 360-degree resonance low-frequency spin technology, and one would have a fake magnet. Dogs would be randomized to 2 groups. One group would be assigned the real collar and the other the sham collar, and the only person who'd know which collar was which would be an impartial, independent researcher. And the caregiver would complete a scientifically validated pain questionnaire, something like LOAD or CBPI, and the dogs would be physically assessed by a veterinary specialist, plus or minus, having objective gait analysis. And this is a fundamental study designed for painkiller research that we all know as a blinded randomized controlled trial. However, the authors chose not to perform a blinded study, and they defended their decision. And again, to quote, they said, "It can also be argued that there was a control to this study, as all dogs acted as their own control by having video analysis taken on day 0 before the dog streams collars were fitted, which could lead to qualitative results lacking bias." And this statement is just an absolutely beautiful illustration of pseudoscience by authors with a declared conflict of interest. And it's quite hard for lay people to see through pseudoscience. So we really need to emphasize true science, and we have some amazing science on this subject. So what happens when a study is performed properly? And this, I think, if you ask me what's the most important veterinary study that influences my field, it is this one, bar none. So I'm just going to talk you through what happened when Doctors Konzemius and Evans did this landmark study. So they took 58 caregivers whose dogs suffered lameness caused by arthritis, and they were randomized to receive either a daracoxib non-steroidal or an inactive placebo that was visually indistinguishable. And so although they knew there was a 50-50 chance they'd be giving a placebo, neither the caregiver nor the attending veterinary specialist knew which group they were in. And the researchers compared caregiver and veterinary reports to an unbiased outcome measure. In this case, it was forced platform gait analysis. And the results were, to not exaggerate, sobering. A caregiver placebo effect occurred 57% of the time. So just to reword that, 57% of caregivers believed their dog had improved when computer analysis showed lameness was unchanged or worse, or they believed their dog was unchanged when gait analysis showed that lameness was worse. And I just asked the public, how does that statistic make you feel? And on average, the answer that I get is consistent with a human instinct termed the fundamental attribution bias. And that means that we tend to dismiss victims of the placebo effect as gullible, confident that we wouldn't be so easily fooled. But nobody was fooled here. The stigma attached to the caregiver placebo effect is unjustifiable. The caregivers in this study desperately wanted their dogs to feel less pain, and who wouldn't? The board certified specialists didn't fare very differently. They also wanted pain relief for their patient, and 4 out of 10 of them offered falsely optimistic reports. So, this is one of a number of studies, and I'll follow up with a cat version. So similar research shows that cat owners are also vulnerable to a caregiver placebo effect. And although it's always tempting to have a cats versus dogs conversation and compare results, it wouldn't be appropriate to suggest that one group is more vulnerable than the other. And to suffice to say that if you care for a dependent and you wish them to feel less pain, then you are vulnerable. And the lesson here is that we're programmed to see patterns. We're hardwired to spot patterns, and more often than not, those patterns will suit our personal preferences. And this makes it easy to spot, for example, Jesus in this dog's rear end, or accept the conclusion of a study that shows that French fries and almonds are equally healthy. It takes effort to dig deeper and search for information which doesn't suit us. And in this case, that the study was funded by the Alliance for Potato Research. Now I'm going to read while this comes up on your screen. It's the author's account of the invisible gorilla experiment, which has become one of the most famous social psychology studies of all time. So imagine you're asked to watch this short video, 3 in white shirts and 3 in black shirts. They're passing basketballs around. And here, while you're watching, you keep a silent count of the number of passes made by the people in white. Now, at this point, a gorilla strolls into the middle of the action, faces the camera, thumps its chest, leaves, spending a total of 9 seconds on screen. How many passes were there? The correct answer, 15 passes. Would you see the gorilla? Now, almost everyone that's asked this question answers yes. And in fact, social psychologists teaching in various universities asked their class, once you know that 50% of people on average will be affected by this situational blindness, would you have noticed? And they say, yes, I would. And how could something be so obvious go unnoticed? But it consistently does go unnoticed. And this experiment and similar studies teach us, at least they teach me, 2 important lessons. Firstly, it's surprisingly easy to miss something seemingly obvious. And secondly, and that's called situational blindness. And secondly, when people learn that on average 50% of people miss the obvious, they almost always conclude that they be one of the 50% who don't. So I'm going to move on to, and one of the questions I listed at the beginning is to ask, can the placebo effect be harnessed? And we know that many factors have a direct effect on treatment outcome that come under this umbrella of placebo effect, and they include expectation of a clinical benefit and just human conditioning, our mood, our age, and social interactions. Quite a nice example is a study where people used an app to self-quantify chronic pain, and they reported significant worsening in their pain on Mondays. And that's just a version of the placebo effect. So can we do something to actually make use of the placebo effect? And the answer, at least in people, is a resounding yes. So the Journal of the Interdisciplinary Placebo Effect, and this publishes a sort of newsletter, and you can see as this scrolls through that once every month there's somewhere between 20 and 30 new publications on the placebo effect, and these are publications intended to help people and clinicians harness the placebo effect and get some kind of benefit from it. And programs that use cognitive behavioral therapy are focused on harnessing the placebo effect. There is something called a placebo by proxy effect, and this is something that can work in two directions. In other words, a caregiver can feel better or worse when their dependent is being treated. And the reverse is also true. So pediatric pain specialists describe an ideal neutral attitude for parents of painful children. And this means that the pain is acknowledged by parents, but not acknowledged obsessively. Naturally, they don't recommend downplaying their child's chronic pain, but they strongly caution against what's called hypervigilance, also known as helicopter parenting. And hypervigilant caregivers, both in human healthcare and veterinary healthcare, they're very common. And pediatric pain specialists describe them as parents with a predilection for intense, closed questioning of their child about their pain. And in my world, it's the animal parents who are sleeping on the floor with their pet, watching their every move. And caregiver hypervigilance is actually known affectionately as pillow fluffing, but it's actually a very damaging thing, which it reinforces chronic pain because it teaches sufferers to focus on their pain. And I strongly believe that this is a phenomenon that we see in animals that are very capable of appreciating the feelings of their human companions. I'm going to give an example of how this can happen and how we can actually make some kind of use from it. So I'll ask you all to picture an elderly arthritic dog who's got signs of severe chronic pain, in this case with a load score of 24. So what we're going to do is change nothing in our patient's life apart from one single thing, and that's the introduction of a therapist. And the therapist in this case is not a painkiller, but a puppy. And although our therapist is not a painkiller, somehow she's triggered in her companion a new lease of life. And what happens here? Well, we've all heard it, that this dog is a different dog. They've got a new lease of life with their new companion. If you filled out a load questionnaire, you would find that this dog shows improvement on a load questionnaire. And that's either because there's a fault of the load questionnaire, or in my opinion, there isn't. It's that these dogs are experiencing the same thing as children who have parents who are having a neutral attitude or a positive mental attitude. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't necessarily require a puppy, of course. It could be, for example, massage therapy, swimming, or stimulating new walking routes. And I think that this is something which is underemphasized in the complementary therapies that people are offering, that this is essentially cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, it's not just a placebo by proxy effect. So there is also a nocebo effect. And I've put together, again, it's a sort of another decision aid here. And I've got the data sheet for Rimadyl up. And if you look at the fine print, you'll see that a nocebo effect, which means a negative effect of placebo, is common. But strangely, it's received no meaningful attention that I'm aware of in veterinary medicine. So in Rimadyl's data sheet, vomiting with carprofen happened in 4 of the treatment group and actually in 5 of the control group. And the same thing was true for diarrhea. And this isn't an isolated example for carprofen. Metacam's data sheet reported vomiting in 1 out of 7 dogs in the control group. And Previcox's data sheet also reported more vomiting in the control group than in the treatment group. So the nocebo effect appears to be a real thing. So I'll move to the next important question, and a little warning in advance. I feel obliged to describe 2 stories about how the placebo effect can kill, and these are, to me, upsetting stories, and they may, I warn you in advance, cause upset to others. So this is the description of a tragic story that happened in 2009. So this is a couple who relied on homeopathic treatments for their eczema-stricken baby, and they were jailed over her death in 2009. So their daughter, Gloria, was so sick with eczema that she was described to the court as constantly crying in pain, having broken skin, and it was constantly oozing fluid. And her parents repeatedly rejected conventional medical treatment and instead opted for homeopathic treatment. Her father is a homeopathic practitioner. And Gloria's parents were found guilty of the most serious case of manslaughter by criminal negligence. And the judge said that 9-month-old Gloria had suffered helplessly and unnecessarily from a treatable condition, and the pair were sentenced to a total of 10 years in prison. Both parents were described as being well educated, and the judge found that they should have known better. Now, homeopathy didn't kill Gloria. After all, homeopathic remedies are essentially water. And tragically, Gloria was killed by the caregiver placebo effect. And so when I hear people say, well, a supplement can do no harm, this is simply not true. A supplement can do terrible harm if it prevents an effective treatment being given. And I told you that there were 2 examples, and the second is something which happened on a much wider scale and was responsible for a huge number of unnecessary deaths. So here's the headline, the answer to the AIDS epidemic is here, proclaimed this man called Matthias Rath. He said that antiretroviral drugs were poisonous and a conspiracy to kill patients and make money. And his quote was to stop AIDS genocide by the drugs cartel, and why should South Africans continue to be poisoned with AZT when there's a natural answer to AIDS? And his natural answer came in the form of vitamin pills. And multivitamin pill treatment was considered by him to be more effective than any toxic AIDS drug. Now, I'm going to just actually make a quote here. I'm going to read something, which is an excerpt from an article about how a government-sponsored caregiver placebo policy killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. And this was written by Dr. Ben Goldacre, and of course famous for his books, Bad Science and Bad Pharma. So I'm quoting here, in 2005, Matthias Rath ran a trial of his vitamins in a township near Cape Town, giving his own formulation, Vitacell, to people with advanced AIDS. In 2008, this trial was declared illegal by the Cape High Court in South Africa. Although Rath says that none of his participants had been on antiretroviral drugs, some relatives gave statements saying they were and were actively told to stop using them. Tragically, Matthias Rath had taken his ideas to exactly the right place. The president of South Africa at the time was well known as an AIDS dissident, and to international horror, while his people died at the rate of 1 every 2 minutes, he gave credence and support to the claims of a small band of campaigners who variously claim that AIDS doesn't exist, that it's not caused by HIV, and that antiretroviral medication does more harm than good. The South African government refused to roll out proper treatment programs. They refused to accept free donations of drugs, and they refused to accept grant money from the Global Fund to buy drugs. In July 2000, the pharmaceutical company Boehringer Ingelheim, that we know well, offered to donate its drug, nevirapine, which could prevent the transmission of HIV from mother to child during labour. But South African government restricted the availability of nevirapine to 2 pilot studies. And in mid-2005, at least 85% of HIV positive people who needed antiretroviral drugs were still refused them. And the study that I've got up on screen here estimated that if the South African national government had used antiretroviral drugs for prevention and treatment at the same rate as the Western Cape province, which actually defied national policy on the issue, 343,000 deaths could have been prevented, and 35,000 babies wouldn't have been unnecessarily born with HIV because of the failure to implement a cheap and simple mother-to-child transmission prevention program. Between 1 and 3 doses of an ARV drug can reduce transmission dramatically. The cost was negligible, but it was not available. So this is science at its worst, and I'm going to move on to a happier story of science at its best. So this story begins with Albert Einstein's 1905 theory of special relativity, which is one of the most important papers ever published in the field of physics. So we all know special relativity. It's an explanation of how speed affects mass, time and space, and it's known by the equation E = mc squared, and it relies on the premise that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. And Einstein's theory of special relativity stood the test of time. Until it didn't. The Opera experiment observes a neutrino beam from CERN in Geneva in Switzerland to Italy's Gran Sasso laboratory, which is, for the American audience, 450 miles, for Europeans and British people, 730 kilometers away. And they presented some results that indicated an anomaly in the speed of subatomic neutrinos. And that was based on a result that 15,000 neutrino events appeared to travel faster than the speed of light, 20 parts per million above the speed of light. And given the potential far-reaching consequences of that result, the the group of Opera commissioned an independent measurement. And I'm just going to quote here, this is what they had to say on the subject. When an experiment finds an apparently unbelievable result and can find no artifact of the measurement to account for it, its normal procedure is to invite broader scrutiny. And this is exactly what the Opera collaboration is doing. It's good scientific practice. So they put the call out to their scientific colleagues, and their scientific colleagues answered. it turned out that there was an electrical error, and once they corrected the electrical error, it was a faulty connection. They found that this was an erroneous result, and Einstein's 1905 theory of special relativity lives on. So this does actually have some relevance to chronic pain, which is what I'm talking about. So we move on from physics to supplements. So what you're looking at here is an image on the left-hand side, which is extracted from the paper on the right-hand side. And the paper on the right-hand side is a meta-analysis of randomized control studies that include use of the joint supplement glucosamine. So the name of this type of plot is called a funnel plot. And here, each of these red dots represents a trial. So effect size, which I mentioned earlier. So if you remember, hypnosis had an effect size of 0.53, which is considered a medium effect size. That's shown on the x-axis. And study size is shown on the y-axis. And what you see with a funnel plot should be a funnel shape. And ideally, your funnel shape should be symmetrical about the true value. So what happens here is that the effect size trend closer to the null as more data are accumulated. So the bigger the study, the closer you get to the truth. So out on the edges, we see some results which appear to support a very big effect of glucosamine with small patient numbers. And in the middle, we have the truth, which is small numbers. But one of the interesting things here is that this is not a symmetrical plot. And why is it not a symmetrical plot? It's not symmetrical because research findings tend to be published if they publish in favor of the person who's funding the study. So if a supplement manufacturer performs a study and it shows that their product has no benefit, they will just file draw that study. So it'll just never reach press. It's kind of like the dating app I showed you earlier, the idea being that you put your best photos on your dating app and you leave the ugly photos for your desk drawer. So this is our starting point. Glucosamine, chondroitin, and combinations have an effect that's so close to zero that it's considered negligible. And the balance of evidence is that they have no meaningful effect. And this is our good science here. So we're going to move from the good science to when things changed. So in this press release, which was published in 2014, a clinical study proves benefits of joint supplements on canine mobility. Royal Veterinary College study found significant improvements over a 6 weeks period. And this, to me, kind of it had the same vibe as the opera study did. However, we found something which is completely different to what everyone else has found. So I went on a sort of pull the thread here. Where is this study? Just couldn't find it. All you can find is information all over UMOVE's website or about the presence of this study. So I contacted UMOVE and asked them if they would share the results. And this is their response. So this is a direct copy and paste. Use of the term clinically proven and reference to data on file have in fact been approved by both the VMD and the Advertising Standards Authority, UK's independent regulator for advertising, who've reviewed our study and its data. However, in the case of our study, which was carried out working with the Royal Veterinary College, the VMD have determined that if we were to place the study into the public domain, they would regard that as being medicinal by presentation and therefore in breach of the regulations. This includes either publishing the study in a journal or sharing details of the results of the study with members of the public, which is why we are unfortunately not able to share the study with you, end quote. So in effect, they did the opposite to the opera group, and I thought, oh, what a shame. wouldn't it be nice if somebody performed an independent study that didn't have to report to the VMD? And sadly, that study has never been done on UMove, but it has been done on a very closely related supplement. So UMove Advanced contains 1,000 milligrams of glucosamine and 600 milligrams of green lip mussel extract. The competition in the USA, a popular supplement, is Dazaquin. That's got 1,100 milligrams of glucosamine, 650 milligrams of chondroitin. So larger quantities of the two thought to be most active ingredients. Now, this is a replication study. So they did exactly the same thing as the Royal Veterinary College, a properly conducted, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trial of Dazaquin compared to an inactive placebo. And what that study found was that the activity monitors, which is a GPS activity monitor, showed that there was no difference between the two groups. But when pet owners were asked to complete client-specific outcome measures, they found improvements in both groups. So in effect, we see a placebo effect very clearly in this study. And it's not just supplements that are prone. This is another very well-conducted, elegant study that was published in 2018. Now, it says it all in the title: lack of effectiveness of tramadol hydrochloride for the treatment of pain and joint dysfunction in dogs with chronic osteoarthritis. Now, although tramadol has a UK product license, it's not approved for use by the US FDA. And there are several reasons why some painkillers are approved by the FDA while others aren't. And from their perspective, a pharmaceutical company, they must provide substantial proof of a positive effect and a good safety margin. Now, the study that's up on screen here is a collaborative study from the universities of Georgia and Missouri. And they used a blinded randomized control study design. And the special feature of this study was the use of a positive control, which was carprofen, as well as an inactive placebo. And just to put it in simple terms, this was the fairest possible test. Tramadol was given at an appropriate dose to dogs with elbow or knee arthritis, and it provided no clinical benefit. And ironically, tramadol was granted its UK approval the same year the study was published. So, at least in Britain, and hopefully more so in the USA, tramadol should have died a death at that point, and that left a gap in the market. So what the public needed was essentially another medication that was perceived to be a big hitter, a powerful painkiller. Without a product license, and that painkiller that filled the gap from 2018 onwards was gabapentin. So what happens when I do what I did earlier and do a Google search and ask three words: gabapentin for arthritis? And this is my number one hit. And previously I told you that my number one hit could never be trusted. But what does this number one hit say? Well, out of 3,120,000 results, my number one hit says that gabapentin is not used for routine pain caused by major injuries or arthritis. And who's the author of this report? The author of the report is the Mayo Clinic. Should we trust the Mayo Clinic is a question I'm going to ask in a moment. The answer is yes. The Mayo Clinic's a non-profit. US audience will probably know it's centered in Minnesota, in Rochester, and it's ranked the best US hospital. And it offers access to more chronic pain clinics than any other organization. And they opened their first one in 1974, actually the year I was born. And so when the Mayo Clinic say that gabapentin is not used for routine pain caused by minor injuries or osteoarthritis, and we should pay attention. But it's not working. There is an epidemic of gabapentin use, both in veterinary healthcare and human healthcare. So regardless of the therapy, I think we should always be asking 3 questions. How does the therapy work? What are the effects and what are the side effects? And we know how gabapentin works. It's an anticonvulsant, and as such, it does its work in the brain. So it should be no surprise that the side effects of gabapentin also occur in the brain. And so what are those brain-altering effects? Well, we know the commonest side effect in dogs is sedation, otherwise known as somnolence, but we can't be sure what they're feeling because obviously they just can't tell us. It's much easier to establish what's going on inside the mind of a person because they can describe it. And although most people taking gabapentin, it produces neither a positive nor a negative effect on their mental health. And mental health problems remain a big problem. And people who do experience an effect, it can push them in one or two directions. In some, it can have an amphetamine-like effect, and that's one of the reasons why gabapentin has become a drug of addiction. And in some people, they'll experience the opposite, which is severe depression. And the data sheet for gabapentin contains a warning that the risk of self-harm and suicide is doubled when people take this drug, and around 1 in 10 people being treated with gabapentin have to stop it because of sinister side effects. So for me, dogs and humans share many of the same responses to painkillers, and there's no reason to suspect that gabapentin would have different effects in dogs and people. So I feel very strongly that safeguarding canine mental health means drawing a distinct line between sedatives like gabapentin and calming medications like tramadol. And we have a responsibility to educate the public that those aren't the same. As I said a moment ago, these drawbacks of gabapentin haven't stopped it from becoming one of the most popular treatments for all sorts of conditions, arthritis being one of the conditions in dogs. And why? Many people would have this argument, well, if it's popular, then it must be good. And that's called the argumentum ad populum, which means it's Latin for appeal to the people, or a bandwagon effect. And it claims something must be good because the majority thinks so. And I would say that if 63 million US citizens voted for Donald Trump in 2016, was their faith in him justified? And many onlookers, the answer would be no. It's inconceivable that he earned 63 million votes based on his political skills. Far more likely is the attitude that he was at the time the lesser of two evils. Now, while I'm not very interested in politics as a clinician and teacher, I do try to understand what influences people's choice. And in my experience, the argumentum ad populum, this bandwagon effect, is a very common decision-making strategy for people choosing painkillers and joint supplements. And so gabapentin's burgeoning popularity for me doesn't imply it's a good choice for arthritis pain. In my view, it's the Donald Trump of painkillers, with hype strength and important limitations which are typically brushed underneath the carpet. One of the exercises that I do with junior vets in the hospitals where I work is ask them, what are the top 3 painkillers that you dispense? And if gabapentin is one of them, I ask them the following question: when was the last time you read the data sheet for gabapentin? And when I do that, being honest, the typical response is that the color drains from their face because they have never read the data sheet for gabapentin. But if they answer, oh, I read it a year or 2 ago, then my conclusion is that they're a liar. And because if they had read the data sheet for gabapentin, it would not be one of the top 3 painkillers that they dispense. So I promised you that I would finish with some controversy, which is to ask the question, is multimodal therapy a myth? And for anyone who knows me, you'll know that my hobby is cycling. I'm a fan of riding my bike, and I'm a fan of professional cycling. And this is one of my personal heroes, a guy called David Brailsford, these days Sir David Brailsford. Now, in 2003, he was hired to help a struggling British cycling team who, at the time, that team was very weak. They'd failed to win a single Olympic gold medal since 1908. And Brailsford was tasked with an intimidating rescue mission, but he did much more than rescue British cycling. Over the course of 10 years of British cycling, the man who's now Sir Dave accumulated 16 gold medals and 59 world championships. And he called his winning approach the marginal gains approach. And this is how he explained it in a 2012 interview. And I'm going to just read a quote here. The whole principle came from the idea that if you broke down everything you could think of that goes into riding a bike and then improved it by 1%, you'll get a significant increase when you put them all together. Now, in 2010, Brailsford became the manager of a new British-based professional cycling team sponsored by Sky Television. At that time, the sport was dominated by teams who were strongly suspected of cheating. The suspicions were confirmed in 2012 when WADA accused professional cycling's most successful team, which is Lance Armstrong's US Postal, of running the most sophisticated, professionalized and successful doping program that the sport has ever seen, and that's a quote. And even if you know nothing about professional cycling, US Postal's modus operandi might sound familiar, because a similar approach to a different problem became the accepted norm for chronic pain management during the same era. And of course, we all know this approach as polypharmacy. So Brailsford arrived in a sport of polypharmacy, and he changed the rules. So he introduced his marginal gains approach without compromising any of the traditional components of success. So that means fitness training and tactics. And Team Sky embraced technology. They optimized athlete psychology, and they looked at countless tiny details in the cyclist's everyday life. And when a journalist asked Brailsford about marginal gains, this is the example that he gave. I'll quote here an example from Dave Brailsford. Do you really know how to clean your hands without leaving bits between your fingers? If you do things like that properly, you'll get ill a little bit less. And they're tiny things, but if you clump them together, it makes a big difference. Now, Brailsford's approach paid substantial dividends, and Team Sky won 7 Tour de France in 10 years. So this is, something that I put together to illustrate, what marginal gains look like. So if you're a pro cyclist, these are your priorities. The base of the pyramid, far the most important, will be training. We're assuming somebody's got the genetic tools to be a professional cyclist, and on top of that, we start with training, and then we move to nutrition, and then equipment, rest, and then once you've got all of those as best that you can get them, you add your marginal gains. So what should we understand by the term marginal gains? Well, synonyms for the word marginal include insignificant, minimal, minor, and negligible. And significant gains, they require hard work, while the marginal gains, they're the low-hanging fruit. For example, consider on the left a grueling training session, which would be a significant gain, whereas a massage would be considered a marginal gain. And a successful athlete's under no illusion, which is more important. If they haven't already made every possible significant gain, the concept of marginal gains is nothing more than wishful thinking. Now, and this is what your starting point looks like for somebody who you're applying marginal gains to in in terms of professional sport. You've got a super athlete, and that super athlete's got their training 100% nailed, their nutrition perfect, all the best equipment, everything in place so that they rest between training. And once you've got all of those things perfect, then you can add your marginal gains. But what we're seeing with arthritis patients is not super athletes. We're seeing the equivalent of this: somebody who doesn't have their training, nutrition, equipment, and rest buttoned up. How do we translate this to canine or feline chronic pain management? Well, here I've mocked up our version. So if our outcome is more years in our pets' lives and more life in our pets' years, at the base of the pyramid easily has to be body composition, being lean and ideally muscular. Follow that with medications. There'll be prescription medications, and then the next on the pyramid I've put surgery, then exercise, and then finally all of those marginal gains, which would be your complementary therapies. But this is the reality that I see all the time, particularly because being a teacher and educator online, I see what happens. The base of the pyramid is not a popular thing. When people see weight loss as a target, what they see is obstacles rather than opportunities. So they see all the things that will prevent weight loss rather than the advantages that they can get from weight loss. And two of the commonest things that we see are that people will say that their pet has got a slow metabolism and is incapable of losing weight for that reason, which is, of course, a fallacy, because your metabolic rate is proportional to your body mass. The heavier you are, the higher your metabolic rate, which is why shows like Biggest Loser are so successful, because when you're very, very big, you're actually a fat-burning furnace. So that's fallacy number one. And fallacy number two is that dogs can't lose weight because they can't exercise. Now, the reason that this is a fallacy is because, well, we've all heard of the fat-burning zone. Fat-burning zone is where we've the fat-burning zone is where, to you or I, you are doing an exercise, which means that you can't hold a conversation. And they've shown that people who have osteoarthritis, they go into that fat-burning zone when they're just pottering along the pavement. And if you just picture an osteoarthritic dog who's maybe walking for 10 or 15 minutes and who is kind of puffing and panting, gasping for air, just going at slow pace, and you compare that dog to a dog that doesn't have osteoarthritis, who's bounding around the field effortlessly for 15 minutes, which of those two is actually burning more calories? It's the osteoarthritic dog, hands down. So sadly, these excuses means that body composition is just not prioritized. And medication is the next thing, and I've seen it time and time again since 1997 when I qualified, and we had carprofen and ketoprofen as really our only two options. That the best medications just often seem to be they have a bad rap from the public. People prefer what's new, the new kid on the block. And in my time, that's been one after the other. It'll be Previcox, Robenacox, Onsior, Robenacoxib, and most recently Librela. The new kids are treated with a great deal of respect, but some of the best painkillers people just don't want to use. And so I often see that this one is also shunted into the sidelines. And surgery, for reasons that we talked about earlier, is considered a last resort to many people, even though operations like total hip replacement, cruciate ligament surgery, and even many of the elbow dysplasia treatments can achieve life-changing benefits, often with relatively low risk. I think exercise is misinterpreted at the moment. There are lots of, I think there are more myths about exercise than there are truths about exercise. So we just shove that off the side. And what you end up happening here is you end up with this massive peak of the triangle, which is all of the complementary therapies, which everyone sees as being their first go-to, and the best illustration of the effect, which I think is going to be my sort of closing slide, is this idea that people are much prefer life hack than hard work. And so this is where I'm going to close up, because I think I've already run over time by a significant amount, so apologies everybody. So what have we learned, and hopefully what the caregiver placebo effect is, and how we can use it to our benefit in terms of trying to alter caregivers' attitude towards pain and trying to avoid hypervigilance. Can placebos kill? Absolutely, they can do a great deal of harm. And I think we really do need to educate the public to say veterinary professionals can't be saying it won't do any harm, because it will do harm. And is multimodal therapy a myth? Well, to me, I think we're making some big mistakes with multimodal therapy, and those are some mistakes I think that we need to address. So the take-home message about the caregiver placebo effect is that anyone is vulnerable. Emotions will always be charged, and these emotions will always try to hijack our ability to make evidence-based choices. So I think if in doubt, apply the tried and tested principle that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably isn't true.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, wonderful talk. I think gives a lot of people a lot of things to say. I think we had some comments. Thank you. Worth getting up at 5 a.m. in Australia to listen to you. But if anyone, I know we've gone over time, Mike, but if anyone has any questions or comments or would like further information, reach out to IVAPM.org and we can get your questions answered by Dr. Farrell. Thanks so much, very, very much for this.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Bye.